This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
The book of Revelation, chapter 13, will be the subject for our study today. In this last communication of the God of heaven to man, we find the message of overcoming the wicked world to be faithful to God and receive a home in heaven at last. That is truly the goal that each and every one of us should desire. And it is possible through Christ as members of His church by following His Word. We've seen through our study how important the Word of God is and adhering to it. It was true in the first century. It remains true in the 21st century. In Revelation chapter 13, we have the appearance of the mark of the beast. For many people, this is what they know about the book of Revelation, the number 666 and the mark of the beast. And it has been variously applied to all sorts of things, to numbers on a license plate, to serial numbers on a piece of equipment. Someone might think that's the reason it keeps acting up, to just all sorts of fanciful views about it. But you have to narrow it down when you look at the text, because 666 is said to be a number of a man, not some inanimate object or not some other thing, but the number of a man. And John is going to tell us how we can identify that man here in the 13th chapter of the book of Revelation today. This person is going to be described as a beast. Let's bear in mind that in the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation, we have the great red dragon identified as the devil. So the great red dragon is the devil. Now then here you're going to have the beast and the false prophet. They will be the two chief characters of chapter 13. We have the artist's description of this as we proceed. You will see that from time to time, and it will help us in our understanding of John's vision. Let's go to Revelation 13 and begin. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Well, we don't want to move too rapidly right here. The beast is coming up out of the sea. The Roman Empire rested upon the Mediterranean Sea and comprised the then known world. And this beast rises up out of the sand of the sea. It shows that he's going to have a worldwide influence, obviously. He has 7 heads. Heads, of course, represent intelligence or authority. He has 7 of them. Again, the number 7 means fullness and completeness. And you see it used even here when applied to the enemy, this beast, because he has complete power. That is what would be meant. Then he also has 10 horns. Again, those horns are symbols of authority. Just like the heads represent the intelligence, the horns would represent perhaps the weaponry that would be employed, and you'll have one in great authority. He has 7 heads and he has 10 horns. And then on his 10 horns, he has 10 crowns. So we're clearly talking about an official capacity here when we see this imagery. But then not only that, but it says, upon his heads, the name of blasphemy. Now, if this is indeed a reference to the Roman Empire, and we're confident that it is, and to its emperors, you might be wondering about why does he have 7 heads? Why does he have these 10 horns and 10 crowns? Well, this may be an enumerated list of Roman emperors. Remember, thus far in our study, we have pointed out how that the Roman emperors were deified, going all the way back to Julius Caesar and then Augustus. It was the case that over time, when one of these Caesars or emperors would die, the Roman Senate would deify them, bestow upon them the title of Pontificus Maximus, or chief priest, a reference to deity. And we have seen also that there were temples. There was a temple in Smyrna, one of the 7 cities to which this book is addressed, as early as 195 BC. There was a temple erected in Smyrna in Asia Minor to Roma. And in it you will find, in a temple, there is veneration or worship to the concept of Rome being the eternal kingdom. So these emperors were being deified. That might indicate something of the blasphemy, names of blasphemy. Again, I want to mention to you this coin that I have. These are, of course, replicas of the ancient coins. This one coming from the time of Tiberius Caesar. And again, I want to read to you what is stated on this coin. This is from the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who ruled during the life of Jesus, AD 14 to 37. And the portrait on the front is Tiberius. And the inscription reads, Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of divine Augustus. Now that's imprinted right there on the coin. On the reverse side shows a seated female, generally thought to be Livia, Tiberius's mother, with the inscription, High Priest. Now I think this is appropriate to bring into our study again at this point, because we're going to see this beast and we're going to see the false prophet. And I wanted to just allow us again to notice that you'll have the Roman emperors being deified, that is, they're referred to as with the words theos, meaning God, and they are revered or worshipped. And then also there's a high priest, and you notice the coin indicative of that. I think that tends to give an explanation as to what is meant by the use of the term blasphemy, names of blasphemy, as these Roman emperors are deified. But reading further in verse 2, the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? So this beast is empowered by the dragon, remember in chapter 12, verse 9, who is the devil. Verse 5, And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things, and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. Again, you'll notice 42 months is 3.5 years. There'll be 1,260 days. That's 3.5 years. 3.5, half of 7. Incompleteness, an indication of something negative or bad, is associated with those numbers. Verse 6, And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And then in verse 7, And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear to hear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Verse 11, And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. So now notice, please, that you have these beasts contrasted. One is coming up, as you see this one here in verse 11. He's coming up out of the earth. The other came up out of the sand of the sea. The first one had 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 crowns. This one comes up out of the earth. He has 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Again, a reference back to the dragon of 12:9. But notice he doesn't have the authority of the first beast. The first one, remember, 7 heads, 10 horns. This one, only 2 horns. That would be authority, but not as much as the first, obviously. Verse 12, And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him. So he is an emissary of the first beast, or receives direction from that first one. And he causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Well, this is the false prophet, the one who is encouraging people to worship the first beast, or we believe that to be the series of Roman emperors who demanded worship. And we've noticed that in the 7 cities of Asia there were a number of pagan temples, but there were also temples that had been erected to Rome itself, as in Smyrna's case, starting with 195 BC. And then a number of the Roman emperors had these temples erected to them. The first one was in 29 AD. That was erected there in the city of Pergamus. But now then, going further in our reading, And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on earth in the sight of men. Notice that he is doing wonders. Verse 14, He deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which He had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live. And He had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding, count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. The number 666. 600, and then of course 3 score. A score is 20, 3 times 20 or 60, and then the single digit 6. 666. It is the number of a man. If we keep that in mind, I think a lot of the dread that is associated with trying to identify the beast here will be taken out of the way. Notice also that this beast that emerges with the power or under the authority of the first beast has the power to force people to worship the first beast. If the first beast is the Roman emperor and the second beast would be the high priest, and there were many high priests officiating in these temples to the emperors across the empire and especially at Asia Minor, notice that how well this would fit. It is of interest for us to see that from ancient times we have this notification. In order for one to buy and sell, he would have to have gone to a temple, to the priest, to the emperor rather, and received from the high priest an official certificate saying that he had worshipped in the temple. That would allow him then to transact business. It would be much the same today as a person getting a business license. You might have a vendor out on a street corner somewhere. If he's creating a nuisance, he's asked, do you have a license? If he says no, he's got to go down to the courthouse, get a license, come back. You got a license? Yes, I do, right here. How do you have that license? Been to the courthouse. All right, you can continue to buy and sell. That way we can collect taxes from you. Well, there are such things as that emerge in the first century, and I have an example of one here that I'd like to read. This comes to us from the book Revelation, written by the late WVBS Jr., with the subtitle of, guess what? Through First Century Glasses. That's the way we want to understand the book of Revelation, is through first century glasses. We're going back to the first century for some documentation about what we are averring here. We read, to those who have been appointed to preside over the sacrifices, from Enares Achaeus, from the village of Theonxius, together with his children, Aias and Hera, who reside in the village of Philadelphia, we have always sacrificed to the gods, and now, in your presence and according to the regulations, we have sacrificed and offered libations and tasted the sacred things, and we ask that you give us a certification that we have done so. May you fare well. See, there's the request. Then the certificate read, we, the representatives of the emperor, Cyrenius and Hermas, have seen you sacrificing. Now, you had to have this in the first century if you were going to transact business. That may be what is alluded to here in Revelation chapter 13, when it says in verse 15, the second beast, the one with the 2 horns that came up out of the earth, he hath power to give life unto the image of the beast, and that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, bond and free, to receive a mark in their right hand and in their forehead. And then verse 17, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. That may give us an explanation about what is taking place by looking at these ancient certificates. And now then, why is this number 666 contained therein? Well, again, as you've noted, we take the direct, forthright, the simplest approach to it, and that is to understand that the book of Revelation is communicated in symbols. Revelation 1:1. He sent and signified it. It's apocalyptic. It's the revelation. You expect symbols. Numbers are used symbolically here. We've indicated that the number 10 or 12 and multiples thereof, like the number 10 multiplied to 1,000, or the number 12 multiplied to 144,000, find usage and application in the book of Revelation and are striven to be symbolically used. Even so, the number 7 we've seen a number of times. We're even trying to follow an overview or outline of the book using the number 7. 7 letters to churches, book with 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of wrath that will come later, and then the finale. Well, the number 7 means fullness or completeness. As we indicated a minute ago, 7 heads on the beast that comes up out of the sand of the sea indicates the fullness of his power and influence, although that power and influence is wicked. Well, the number 7 then, or multiples thereof, like 777, would indicate fullness and completeness. But then contrariwise, falling 1 short of that to the number 6, and multiples thereof, the number 666, always has a negative connotation. Now, I do not believe that the people who received the book of Revelation, written to the 7 churches of Asia, would have the trouble with the number 666 that we have in the 21st century. Because you see, they would already know about this high priest officiating in the temple up the street. Remember the city where there was a temple at either end of the street? And they would already know about the persecution that began in intensity with Nero in 64 AD that had grown to sweep across their peninsula in AD 96 when this book is written. They would already know that. They wouldn't need to study history. They were living history at the time. So I don't think it would be the perplexing problem that it is for many people today. But some have endeavored to solve this by using what is called gematria. That is where a letter stands for a number. And when you do that with the Hebrew alphabet, and you do that with the Latin alphabet, and you take those letters and you correspond those letters 666 to a name, you get the name Nero Caesar. The letters that are appearing, Nun, for example, would equal 50, Vol, 6, Resh, 200, Nun, 50 again, equaling 306. And then the other letters being Resh, 200, Simek, 60, and Kaf, 100 for another 360 would be the number 366. And that would correspond to Caesar. Neron, 306, would be Nero, and then the Caesar, 360, for a total of 666. Now I'll tell you the weakness of doing this. The weakness of doing this is if you start out with the name that you anticipate, you usually can arrive at the numbers and how they break down. The weakness of it is seen in that this book was written in the Greek language. I was just speaking with Brother Chuck Horner, and he told me that when he studied the book of Revelation under Norman Gibson, he had them to study it in the Greek language. Aren't you glad we're not making you do that? Well, the book is written in Greek. And so you would expect that if the numbers correspond to an alphabet here in Revelation 13:18, wouldn't you expect that it would be the Greek alphabet? Well, if that is so, you come up with different names. So I wanted you to see the use of gematria to arrive at the name Nero Caesar, but I also wanted you to see the weakness of doing that it's more often the case that you start with the name you anticipate and work your way backwards to the numbers. But it was a common use in ancient times, and we still use that some today as numbers, letters being numbers standing for letters. But as I've indicated, I don't think you'd have much trouble knowing this was a reference to the Roman emperor. Now, why Nero Caesar? Because he was the first one to persecute Christians as intensely as he did in the city of Rome. Remember Christians being thrown to lions and the various persecutions we've mentioned, being set on fire and used as torches at night to light the way for parades and things of that type. That took place under Nero Caesar. When the city burned, he blamed its destruction on Christians. So Nero Caesar would be an indication of Rome. But the time in which we find the book of Revelation to have been written is in the latter part of the 1st century, and therefore we look to, instead of Nero Caesar, we look to one who's ruling on his throne, which would be Domitian. He reigns from AD 81 to AD 96. Now another thing I like to do, because I don't know if often we concentrate on this when we go through the Bible, but I'd like for us to notice the presence of this false worship in the 1st century, that is the worship of false gods. And in order to do that, why don't we just drop back to the book of Acts for a moment. Let's go back to the book of Acts and take note of a few passages of Scripture. For example, in Acts chapter 14, on the first missionary journey of Paul, you remember in Acts chapter 14 when they come to the city of Lystra, verse 8, they find that the people there are honoring Paul and Barnabas as if they are gods, and they intend to worship them, and Paul will have none of that. But then in verse 12, and they call Barnabas Jupiter. Now that's the Greek name for the Latin Zeus, the chief god among them. And Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Jupiter. You mean there was a priest of Zeus in the city of Lystra in Asia Minor? That's what I mean to tell you. That's the point I want to underscore, is they were worshiping these false gods. Now this is not a Roman emperor, but a pagan god, but they were worshiping these pagan gods right there in Lystra, and Paul and Barnabas encountered that on the first missionary journey. Then the priest Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates, and would have done sacrifice with the people. So they were actually sacrificing animals to false gods. And you remember the rest of the story. Paul and Barnabas refused, and love turned to hate. They were stoned. Paul was stoned and drug out of the city for dead, but he was able to arise and go on about his business. Later in the book of Acts, if you'll turn ahead to Acts chapter 28 in verse 11, you will see as Paul has been shipwrecked and he is on his voyage to Rome, you will see in verse 11 that after 3 months we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. Well, who are Castor and Pollux? They are the sons of Zeus, so called. So notice how common that was in antiquity. But again, we're not through. I want to really underscore this. In chapter 17 of the book of Acts, here we find Paul on his second missionary journey arriving in the city of Athens. What was in Athens? The Parthenon. What was the Parthenon? Well, it was an edifice built to honor the chief god Zeus. Notice what happens when Paul comes into the city. You remember this? He had been through the city and then down. Let's look down at Acts chapter 17 at verse 22 when Paul arrives at the Areopagus, also called Mars Hill. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. And of course the translation of that can be deeply religious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God, whom ye therefore ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. And then, as you know, Paul declares the living God, and he concludes his sermon by saying, In the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a time in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. Acts 17:30 and 31. How do you think that message went over? Well, Luke tells us the conclusion of it, but how do you think that message would play out as emperor worship and pagan worship intensify in toward the first century? Well, it would be very difficult upon one who would declare with such clarity that message. Now notice also in the book of Acts chapter 19, over at the city of Ephesus, what does Paul run into there? He runs into the temple of Diana. And remember the opposition that he faces? There were silversmiths who made these little statuettes of the goddess Diana. People would buy them as a religious sort of thing, a religious icon. And when Paul came in there, he's preaching that there is one God, and it is, guess what, not Diana. Now, to again emphasize the popularity of false and pagan worship, notice that this temple to Diana at Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it was 4 times the size of the Greek Parthenon in Athens. So we're not talking about a little hut and some oddballs over here. We're talking about something that most of the people participated in. And you'll remember they had an arena there at Ephesus that would seat 25,000 people. And they wanted to drag Paul into that arena and to put him on trial. They really wanted to tear him limb from limb for criticizing the goddess Diana. And they said that the whole world worships the goddess Diana. And they didn't let Paul get in there because they were fearing for his life. But you'll remember on that occasion, Demetrius, who's one of the craftsmen, he said, well, the law is open, we have our recourse, and let's deal with it that way. And it was not a lawful assembly, and they dismissed the crowd. But what I wanted you to see is that in the book of Acts, you have those kinds of things. We see it now again when we turn to the book of Revelation. We see worship of emperors and pagan gods taking place here. And that's the background of the book of Revelation. And since we're not that familiar with it, maybe it makes it difficult for us to understand the book of Revelation. So now knowing that, maybe we will be in a better position to understand Revelation. But I'm not through. I want you to notice that toward the second half of the 3rd century, the persecution of Christianity. Now, we've seen these Christians being persecuted. We've repeatedly noted that they are being exiled, they are being jailed, they are actually being killed. And as we've seen in chapter 6, they're being killed in large numbers, and the Lord is telling them it's not finished yet. It's going to continue. It's going to grow. What happens after the close of the New Testament period, and by that I mean the 1st century, when this book is written, that's it. That's the last communication from God to man. It's written now in 66 books, and we're not to add to it or take away from it. With the close of the 1st century, you know what we find? We find the Roman Empire so hateful against Christianity that there are concerted efforts on the part of emperors to annihilate, to destroy, to eradicate Christianity itself. An example of this is in 250 AD, when Decius, who was the Roman emperor, launched out to find Christians wherever he could and destroy them. That is followed up in 303 AD, when Diocletian, another Roman emperor, does the same thing. How are these Christians responding? Friends, they had the book of Revelation, and they saw these messages that you and I read and really only imagine concerning what it would be to stand for Christ if it meant the loss of life. These people were being instructed, as we've seen, and perhaps one of the more familiar verses to us in Revelation 2 and verse 10, but be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee the crown of life. Unto death, not until. We hope we can stay faithful till we die, and then we can be saved ultimately and finally. No, not until, but unto is the word. That is up to and through the point of death. They were being encouraged to endure even if it cost them their lives. And that's what many of them did during the first 3 centuries after the birth of Christ. We learn, of course, about martyrs at this time period. One by the name of Polycarp. Polycarp said when he was an elderly man and the authorities came to his house to take him out to kill him, he said, 86 years have I served him. He has never denied me, and I will not deny him now. And his life was taken from him. That was happening all across the Roman Empire. The effort was to snuff Christianity out. But the Christians did not resist. They did not rise up in arms like happened later in the Crusades when so-called Christians fought against Muslims in carnal warfare. That didn't happen. They followed what they learned from the book of Revelation, and they remained faithful to God. And it was said of them of that time period, the blood of the martyrs has become the seed of the kingdom. It instilled in those who were living the rich value of living for God in this temporary environment that we simply call the world, and remaining true and faithful to God no matter what the cost. Now, with that as a kind of understanding, knowing something of the times, imagine the Edict of Toleration in 312 AD, when Constantine, the Roman emperor, wanted to take this fierce loyalty that Christians had for Christ and somehow use that to enhance the empire. He could not snuff Christianity out. It could not happen. It was not going to happen. The book of Revelation's message was firm. Those people believed it. So do we. That the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of His Christ, and He shall reign forever and ever. No matter what it looks like around you right now, no matter the odds, the kingdom of Christ will be victorious. The Son of God died for us to save us from our sins. May we never be deterred from the worship and service of the Master, even if it costs us our lives. When Constantine, the Roman emperor, saw that, he wanted to use that to the advantage of the empire. He saw he couldn't defeat Christianity, and so he began to reward people by having them become Christians, and he would even have them receive a certain reward if they would be baptized, which was indeed a farce. And even Constantine himself wanted to wait till later on in life to be baptized. You know why? He knew baptism was for remission of sins, Acts 2:38. Maybe he thought he could follow that plan and be forgiven of his many sins toward the end of his life. That's between him and God. But I don't think it's an advisable practice. Today is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 at verse 2. Well, I've wanted to mention all of those things to us so that we could appreciate the background of Revelation chapter 13. Now, let me mention something to you here also. This, in Revelation 13, the man who is mentioned here, who has this number, the number 666, is referred to by many people as the Antichrist. And a lot of people will just say, the Antichrist in Revelation. Well, now then, the word Antichrist is imported into the book of Revelation by that action. Because the word Antichrist, it has the prefix anti, meaning against, and Christ, of course, meaning Christ, against Christ. It is not found at all in the book of Revelation. Now that might be a surprise to some, say, well, here this is the Antichrist. Well, he's not referred to as the Antichrist in the book, not by John, or there's no reference to Antichrist here. But there's no argument either that he is against Christ. But being the Antichrist, as if he is the one and only, I think is a dangerous position to take. And here's why. Let's drop back where the word Antichrist appears in the New Testament to John's epistle. Remember, the same writer, John, but he's not writing in the book of Revelation now. He's writing in the first epistle of John. We go in chapter 2 of the book down to verse 18. Little children, it is the last time. And as ye have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now there are many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. So during John's lifetime, he said he was living in the last time. And the last time, or the last days, began with the first Pentecost after the resurrection in Acts 2, and continue until the second coming of Christ that will occur when no man knows. People don't know that. Hal Lindsey, Valverde, John Hagee, Tim LaHaye, they don't know when that is going to be. They can do all the speculating they want, they don't know. And this tells us that it is the last time. Christians are admonished to be ready always. At the Lord's choosing, He's going to return. But some don't like to think about the last time being such a long period of time. Nor do they like to think of there being many Antichrists. They just want one, and they want the individual in Revelation 13:18 to be that one and only Antichrist. No, John says that it is the last time. John was in the last time just as we are. And he says, you've heard that Antichrist shall come. Even now there are many Antichrists. Now that same point is made later in verse 22 when we see more of the characteristics of those who'd be against Christ. Who is a liar but he that denieth that Jesus is the Christ? He is Antichrist that denieth the Father and the Son. And there are several other references to Antichrist in the book of John that you can trace out for yourself. But I just want you to see that to refer to the being in Revelation 13 as the Antichrist, yes, he's the Antichrist. He would be chief among them at his time, but Revelation doesn't refer to him as the Antichrist. And we have the responsibility in every book of the Bible, including this one, to do what Peter admonished in 1 Peter 4:11 and speak as the oracles or the utterances of God. Well now, as we have done, we have just a few minutes and we want to expose the idea of premillennialism, and in doing so we come to that concept as is mentioned here. The idea of premillennialism is that there's going to be a 7-year period of tribulation, and they think it's mentioned in the book of Revelation. Well, there's tribulation, but a 7-year period, that's another matter. We can't find that here. It just is not supported, as the premillennialists say, that it covers from chapter 6 to 19. It doesn't do any such of a thing. Now then, what they say about this Antichrist, the Antichrist rising up, is they say that there are some signs that indicate that and point to it. Way back in the late 70s when Hal Lindsey wrote his first book, he said that the signs of the coming Antichrist would be a 10-nation confederacy. Where is he getting a 10-nation confederacy? He's basing it on the 10 horns of this 7-headed beast that comes up out of the sea, the sand of the sea. He says, oh, when you see 10 horns in the European Commonwealth or the European Union of Nations, well, you can know that this time is right at hand. Now, he really did that, and it's in that book, and you can read it if you'd like to. But it shows you what happens when men speculate and they don't read the book of Revelation through 1st century glasses, but through 21st century glasses, and in Lindsay's case, through 20th century glasses back then. Because if that was true, if there were 10 nations in the European common market, well, then all these things would start to happen. There'd be one who would pop up as an Antichrist, and that's what they've thought, and there have been various suggestions as to who the Antichrist was, from people like Adolf Hitler all the way down through time. Someone even suggested Henry Kissinger was the Antichrist. I never heard from him to see what he thought about that. But then it would be some world-renowned leader that would take over and take charge. Well, are there going to be 10 nations in the European common market? Friends, by 1986, there were more than a dozen nations in the European common market. Today, there are more than 24 nations in the European Union. Lindsay's missing it, you see. He's trying to read Revelation through 21st century glasses. That's why people like him, and for example, John Hagee in his book, Countdown to Armageddon, he does the same thing. And the signs that he looks to, well, as those signs, the dates and the people and the events, as those things come and go and then Armageddon doesn't occur, that makes those people like John Hagee false prophets. You don't need to follow them. You can get their books that are outdated now very cheaply because they contain information that's not right. Again, bear in mind in Deuteronomy 18, if a man claims himself to be a prophet and he says something that doesn't come to pass, he's to be rejected. He's not to be followed. We are not obligated to follow these people just because they can come up with a fancy theory. Further, we have the admonition, as I've mentioned in 1 Peter 4:11, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as of the ability which God giveth, that God in all things may be glorified through Christ Jesus. What happens? We don't speak as the oracles of God. God doesn't get the glory. Man does. And how Lindsay makes millions of dollars off selling a book. John Hagee's made millions and millions of dollars off selling his books. Man gets the glory and not God. We must speak as the oracles of God speak. In the closing few moments that we have, we want to call our attention to worship that is in spirit and in truth, John 4 and verse 24. As you see in this text, the Roman emperor had a high priest, and he's described here as a beast with the power of the dragon, the devil. And he had a mouth, speaking, the high priest did, speaking great things and causing people to worship these images. Well, you see that in our day. And the application of this, the contextual approach where you take this lesson and you learn it and you apply it to our day, is something in the closing minutes of our time together I'd like to encourage us to do. We do not need to worship at the shrine of Hollywood. Hollywood makes lasciviousness and lewdness and lustfulness glamorous, and has people wearing scant clothing, has people involved in alcohol and drug abuse, in marrying, divorce, and remarrying for any reason whatever. And many people are worshiping at that shrine. That's an application that I think can be made. And there are many others. We want to worship God, who is the correct object of worship, in spirit and in truth, as John taught us in his book, John 4 and verse 24. Return and be with us again, and we'll study Revelation 14 together.